Welcome back to the Enterprise AI News. I'm your host, Troy Agrodon, and I'm here with my co-host, Ian Wilson. Ian, how are you?
Great. How's everybody?
Good, good. So I gather we're going to be talking about AI in HR and workforce situations today. What have you got?
Yeah, interesting area. A lot of people I'm talking to in the HR world are really looking at where AI can be used in their particular business function. Just a quick one here, and it just kind of kicks us off. It's talking about a company called Vizia that does HR software. This one uses AI and analytics to provide insight into employee well-being, employee satisfaction, employee productivity, and how employees and teams work and collaborate in different environments. And here's where the looking at Office, Zoom, Slack, etc. So basically, our offline tools
I
when
think
people
we are
working
online,
remotely.
our online tools.
But one of the interesting things about this particular company was talking about what they call people cloud, and it bridges the gap between people and business outcomes, which sounds a bit fluffy, but it's actually
Sounds
really
very
interesting.
fluffy.
Which is that there's a gap between, I can tell you, it says, I can tell you about the outcome, I can tell you about the input, but I can't tell you about the piece in the middle, which is how people work, which is really interesting because we can't do that. We can monitor outcomes. We know what we've put into a system, but what enterprises don't actually know is who did what in the middle. And that has both positive and negative potential aspects, which we'll see a number of. The positive one is, of course, being able to measure and track what you're doing. The more negative one is people don't like being monitored. And this brings us on to another article on kind of the same thread in a different area, very much again workforce focus. But this one, Toyota puts invisible AI eyes, which is a brand name, in its North American factories. And what this is doing is using cameras to monitor the workforce staff and for a number of different areas, making more intelligent decisions regarding quality, safety, and productivity. Now, I've seen a lot of cameras working in the area of safety to make sure, for example, on construction sites, workers are wearing hard hats,
Right.
not going in restricted areas. What this one is also doing, and I think it's interesting, if you can see this bit here, it's making a skeleton from the body of the workers
Mhm.
to see how productive they are at doing their production line tasks.
Be clear, it's not turning the workers into skeletons. It's doing pose analytics using computer vision.
Thank you.
So essentially, it's mapping the movement of the workers and then being able to look at them from an efficiency perspective.
It is a much more intelligent and sophisticated way of saying what else. Yes, exactly. Um, which I think is interesting. Now, some people might say, well, surely they're just going to be using it to make sure the workers are not slacking off, which is very possible. And this is an area where I would have an ethics group in a company decide what's your line.
Right.
What do you think is ethical at this point? Because we don't have any scientific measures of if you actually monitor workers too much, does it degrade performance? Do they get upset and actually start churning? Which,
It
yeah,
makes me think of the conversation that you've often had with me, which is your desire to be very clear on like what is ethical and what is regulatory.
mm,
And to backtrack to the prior story, it's like, sure, you can have monitoring in there, and there isn't a lot of case law. There's not a lot of, generally speaking, around employee monitoring and surveillance. And so if they are doing things like saying, hard hat, yes or no in a hard hat zone, that's one thing. If they're now saying you walk like a slob because your back is bent over and you're inefficient, and Joe with the bad back says, well, too bad.
yeah,
What are you
yeah.
going to do about it? How, as you said, where is that line? There probably isn't. There's not a hard boundary from a
Mhm, mhm.
regulatory perspective. So that's where this softer sort of ethics side could come in and say the employees are comfortable with this or not comfortable with this because they see the benefit of it or they don't. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting questions around these kinds of systems.
I think there definitely are. And this is a good example of it and how they're not handled well at all, in my opinion. So Amazon installs AI cameras to monitor its delivery drivers. Um, Again, clickbaity on the title because that's not strictly true. It kind of is true. Privacy campaigners label company's latest move, and I'll just say in an incredibly unprofessional way, intrusive and creepy. Really? Creepy? That's your professional judgment on what this is?
Well, it didn't say privacy expert or advocate or researcher. It said campaigner. So who knows what that was? But what's
Well,
the gist of it? What are they actually doing?
let's,
Okay, let's.
let's take a look at what they're actually doing, which is they've actually got two cameras, one that looks forward and one that looks at the driver from its Amazon branded vans in the UK. So no doubt that's probably a single country trial, but something they would probably want to roll out. And they're meant to detect dangerous behavior, including hard braking, speeding, driver distraction, and will send voice alerts if these standards are breached, which all sounds generally, like the kind of thing you probably would like to have. Cameras are understood to automatically switch off when the vehicle's ignition is off, so they're just watching driving. This person, director of Big Brother Watch, called the rollout excessive, intrusive, creepy for worker surveillance and said it should be put on hold. So it sounds like a rather not very thorough way of looking at what the pros and cons are there, besides saying it's creepy. But
I mean, come on, this is the leader of Big Brother Watch, so let's.
yeah.
Surprised here.
Oh, it's also Orwellian, highly inaccurate, which I'm guessing was completely made up. But let's take a look at what do the product people say. Since the technology was introduced in the US, there has been a 48% decrease in accidents. Oh my God, hard numbers. According to Amazon, driving without a seatbelt was down 60% and distracted driving fell by 75%. So those are interesting. But still, again, you have this kind of ethical question about, do drivers want to be watched? I would say if you're driving for a company, you should kind of expect that. And what I would also say, if you're looking at this from an ethical perspective, imagine as in the olden days, drivers would always be sat with a mate. They'd always have two of them. That person might be their boss and they would always be watching them. So I think you want to take a look at it from the perspective of, if it was another person there, would that be okay rather than it just being a machine? But I would also say, if you're trying to make ethical judgments about a particular technology, then you need to be talking about 48% decreases in accidents and countering that as a point, not saying it's creepy, because that just looks incredibly unprofessional when you've got a company that's got hard data and numbers that are pretty compelling. So that's where we're looking at some of these items on workforce. So that is an interesting area. But we talked initially about HR, and there's a lot more to HR than just workforce. So this is a report from a HR AI company, not an independent report, but I think it's got interesting data anyway. 92% of all HR leaders plan on using AI to acquire talent.
Clearly a vendor-led report.
That's probably a good example of AI bias.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, I always like to see these reports because they do have nuggets of information.
Oh, it's from Eightfold. Yeah, of course, the HR AI company. Everybody's going to be buying HR AI. By the way, call us.
By the way, Thomas, yeah, I mean, a great company anyway, got some good stuff. But this I thought was interesting because it's probably quite representative of where the money's going right now in terms of HR or what people are doing. So you've got three categories: not using AI at all, starting to use AI, fully implemented in one or more solutions, or unsure. But I think what's actually interesting is just looking at where people are focusing. Some of them were interesting. Employee records management. It sounds very much like plumbing, but it's probably quite a hard problem. Payroll processing, but recruitment and hiring. This is where everyone thinks it's going. Now, starting to use AI, 44%. This, I think, is the biggest one here, isn't it? It is. So obviously that's starting to gain traction because it's where all the chatter is right now. Using sure. So that I see as the next horizon, where a lot of the initial focus has been on just managing records and handling payroll and benefits, which would make sense. This, I think, performance management, the next one down, that's also got 38% as being starting to use AI. Onboarding is always a pain. Retaining current employees. This, I think, ties a lot to performance, which is looking at when you start seeing negative signals from performance. Often those are signals that indicate you might get churn from employees. So that's a real cost benefit if you can stop employees leaving. Cross-skilling and reskilling, that's just training, creating cultural rewards. I think that might be like gamification, managing talent mobility. I think that's a bit of a sideshow. But I think a couple here that I think are particularly key are recruitment, automation, performance management, and this retaining current employees, which I do tie to that performance management piece as well. So some interesting areas, and a lot of companies building out specific solutions for all of these.
Yeah, and it seems like I've got a couple of thoughts on this. One, I'm struggling to find the connection between this and the kind of employee surveillance tools that sounds dark and Orwellian, as they said in the last one, but let's call it what it is: monitoring and surveillance. Essentially, is that rolled under performance management? I don't know. Or is it
Yeah, it's not kind of,
optimization and safety? Like, where does that live?
it's not really captured there, is it?
Well, it's certainly not in this fluffy language. And the other thing I look at with this report, again, being a vendor-led report, they're like, hey, here are the 10 things we do well, and here's where everybody is using them. Let's just only talk about that and not talk about all the things we don't do. So I can see it from inside the content creations, sausage making factory. And so I look at these things very suspiciously at this point, basically. I just think there's almost no value in these kinds of reports.
Okay, so you just completely negated my point.
That's okay. I still think it's an interesting thing because this is the kind of content that's out there. I mean, there's probably, as you said, there's not no value. This is indicative of things that are going on and places you could apply the technology. I'm just suspicious about these particular subcategories, which are conveniently lined up probably with Eightfold's product portfolio and feature set, right?
Well, I mean, this is where I picked out recruitment, performance management, and retaining employees, because that's from my experience rather than just because they put it on there.
For sure.
So those are the ones I think are particularly interesting right now, as well as these employee monitoring.
It's monitoring and surveillance. And I mean,
but surveillance just sounds,
it's sounds dark. It has the negative connotation, but it is what it is.
It sounds Orwellian and creepy.
Yes, and invasive. That's what Big Brother watches.
That's what Big Brother.
I don't even disagree with them, honestly, but it's just like you said, putting fluffy, scary adjectives up against 50% reduction in accidents.
That's always the point, is that there's actually something there.
Yes.
You like call it Orwellian and creepy,
right?
Because there's a concern there. It's very genuine.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's a wrap up for HR and AI today.
Excellent. Yeah, there's a ton of interesting stuff, and not just, Slam Eightfold. They're a great company. They've got excellent funding. They've had huge traction in the space. So I'm not picking on them. They're doing their best to sort of generate content marketing pieces here, which is fair game. And I think that there is a ton of interesting stuff I'd love to do. I know we'll probably talk a lot more about kind of the innovations that are happening in the space in HR specifically. I'd love to dig into more of those kind of monitoring and surveillance type stories, because I think we're going to start to see the challenges, the union challenges, maybe legal challenges in those areas soon. So that would be, I think, an interesting story.
I think there were some quotes from unions on the Amazon one.
Yes, it said something about they didn't mind the forward-facing cameras seeing the road. They didn't like seeing the drivers or something. I think we'll see a lot more in that space. So that's great for today. Well, thank you very much, Ian, for bringing all those to the table today. I think we'll wrap up with that. And that's it for today's episode. So if you enjoy these quick news updates, you know what to do. Please do like and comment and subscribe and share and do all those things. That really helps get the word out. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Bye-bye.